Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are rejoined by past guest Leah Tarachonsky, who is an independent journalist, documentary filmmaker based in Canada. She's Israeli Canadian, but yes, she's based in Canada, in Toronto, and is working on a PhD, which we're going to get into. Former correspondent for the Real News Network, and did a brilliant documentary, which we talked about last time, On the Side of the Road, which her own production company did, and was aired on Al Jazeera and Telesur English. And yep, we're going to be talking about all things Israel. So, but first, Ms. Tarachansky, thank you so much for coming back on One Plus One.
Thanks for having me, Yuri.
It's an honor to have you. And just before I get to these first question, I want to ask two questions of you before I get to these main questions, which is now, when the murder of George Floyd happened in Minnesota, which sparked nationwide protests in the United States and also global protests across the globe, were in Australia, New Zealand, yours truly, Canada, and all across Europe. It seemed as if people were doing solidarity protests, but also everyone was sort of speaking out against each country's internal racism, whether it's France, which has anti-black racism and police brutality, Australia, Canada, and so forth. Now, Israel, there has been in Israel. Was there any solidarity protest for George Floyd, or is any of the protests happening in Israel all just related to the kind of anti-Netanyahu protest and the COVID protests?
Yeah. The one thing you should understand in terms of context is that U.S. Struggle for civil rights is deeply connected to what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and has been connected for decades. So, for example, in the 60s and 70s, when the height of the Black liberation movement was taking place in the U.S., and the Black Panthers started in the west coast of the United States, they were so inspiring to so many nations and to so many communities of people struggling for freedom and equality that Black Panther Party started in Israel. Rather, they didn't call themselves the Black Panther Party, they were just called the Black Panthers. And even though the movement represented Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, who are Jews of color, basically, not necessarily Black Jews at the time, but people who came from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, North Africa, or descendants of the Sephardic community, people who left Spain in the Spanish Inquisition. They were considered like people of color in the Israeli Eurocentric settler colonial myth of who belonged to the state, right? So they were, when those Jews came to Israel, or rather when those Jews were brought to Israel in the aftermath of Israel's creation, they were housed in kind of the worst parts of the country, parts of the country that were on the front line of the conflict. So border towns that were getting attacked and shelled. And they were basically ignored and left there in development towns with very little resources. And the Black Panthers started out in Jerusalem at a time when Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel. And basically, in inspiration of the US, were demanding that they be treated as human beings. And the amount of racism that they got in return is really shameful. But what happened was European politician, or rather a politician of European ancestry, saw an opportunity in that movement and kind of wrote it into office. And when Begin was elected, he really presented himself as the voice of the downtrodden, these Jews of color, and he's going to make change. And he's white. And he was totally white.
Of the Likud party, which is, I mean, I mean, all the Israeli parties are Zionists, but Likud, especially under Netanyahu, is like, I would classify as like ultra Zionist, right? Ultra right,
Begin wasn't
and very right wing on top of that.
Begin was one of the leaders of the militias that contributed to the Nakba, the expulsion of 2/3 of the Palestinians to make Israel possible. So he's old school colonial mentality in terms of Palestinians. But to Begin's credit, unlike the liberal labor kind of Zionism, he comes from a line of Zionism that doesn't live in a bubble of denial and pretension about the intention of Israel. Like, he's part of the right mentality that says, yeah, we're here to take, we're here to live, we're here to establish a state, and we're going to do that at whoever's expense is necessary. And so, the right has always seen the legitimate frustrations of people of color or Jews of color in Israel, specifically as an opportunity to exploit politically. And Netanyahu has been doing that amazingly. And that's what's been keeping him in office for 11, 12 years, is that the bulk of his current electorate, the people who vote for him, are frustrated young people, descendants of Jews of color, who are themselves Jews of color, who he's kind of driving a wedge between them and like the elite European white academic weak, urban, these two kind of like myths are drawn as opposites of each other, when there's like an obvious much bigger question, which is in the 80s, thousands of Jews came from Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia, and they are Black Jews who are even further down the rung, who have been experiencing and trying to speak up against experiencing intense levels of police brutality and racism. And because in Israel we have these very clear striations in the society, kind of like in France or in Russia, being a Black Jew as opposed to being a Mizrahi Jew is a big difference. And so that sparked, I wouldn't say that the Black Lives Matter in the US specifically sparked it, but they certainly, catalyzed a spark that was already there. Certainly 2020, also in the 2020 of Black Lives Matter, a huge outburst of Black Lives Matter protests in Israel.
Actually, can you repeat that, because there was a cuts in the call for some reason.
Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Where did it cut me off?
You were saying that start from where, like, how, like, when you're a Black Israeli Jew, and then start from there, because there seems to be like an interruption in the call. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So so basically the first generation of the kids who are either brought to Israel very, very young from Ethiopia mostly, but some also from Eritrea and Somalia, they are either brought as kids or they're born in Israel, and they grow up in an extremely racist environment where, we have very clear striations in Israeli society, kind of like in France or Russia. Or Japan, like it's very clear where you stand. So I'm born in the Soviet Union, so that means that I'm a what they call a Russian Jew, even though I didn't come from the Russia part of the Soviet Union. And so, like, I know that my place is somewhere above the Ethiopians, but somewhere below the Mizrahim. And so being a Black Jew means that you are even lower than that in terms of access to resources, in terms of street level bigotry, in terms of police brutality. And for many years we've seen, I'm not saying that the Black Lives Matter in the US is what caused it, but it certainly catalyzed a spark and a fire that was burning, which is an Ethiopian-led, Black Jewish-led protest movement in Israel, which is a Black Lives Matter movement. And then all of those tensions, right? So the Mizrahim are all of these things that I'm describing are in the modern current state of Israel, which is an ethnocracy, a state that's built for the benefit of its Jewish citizens, but is also under but is also controlling half of the population of the territory, which is not Jewish. And if you talk about Black Lives Matter, one of the things that the pro-democracy movements in Israel and Palestine were echoing in terms of Black Lives Matter is Palestinian Lives Matter. And we saw a lot of protests like that, and a lot of signs like that, a lot of social media work like that around the BLM uprising, especially in 2020. But going back, there's a lot of connections. Angela Davis wrote a book about the connection between the civil rights movement and Israel and Palestine. A lot of people refer to Israel-Palestine as the civil rights movement of our time. Obviously, a lot of Black South African leaders have made connections there. And if you go back, I mean, it is still quite taboo in a lot of African American communities to kind of refer to Israel in terms of apartheid, but a lot of that is changing, largely thanks to the work of anti-Zionist Jews, or Jews who are critical, who are starting to show that that Israel's control over the Palestinians is a settler colonial control, that the occupation is a form of apartheid, and that even inside of Israel there is a clear distinction between Jewish citizens and second-class citizens and Palestinian citizens. So these things are very intertwined, very connected, and I think that they come from the same place, which is both in the American context and in an Israeli context. You're looking at two countries who are powerhouses. Israel is one of the strongest nations in its region. It's definitely got the biggest nuclear arsenal. It's got one of the strongest economic economies, and it's got a reputation, which it has fought very, very, very hard to defend, of being strong and aggressive, and oftentimes also faking it in order to appear very strong and aggressive and brutal, so that it gains a bit of strength and stability in a region that has been very hostile. So both Israel and the U.S., are states that their citizens live and are constantly fed this narrative of, we are a great country, we're an amazing country, we've done amazing things for our citizens, we're a democracy, we're the best democracy, we're the only democracy, all this nonsense. And then you look at the reality, and you have hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. living on the streets, millions of people living on the streets. There's a huge intersection between access to healthcare and homelessness and people and race, police brutality, obviously, all of the markers of quality of life intersect with race in the U.S. And it's the same thing in Israel. If you are a white Jew with European ancestors, the kind of life that you're going to have, it's very different than if you are a Black Palestinian who lives, let's say, in Rahat. Even if you are a citizen of Israel, the kind of life you're going to have is going to be distinctly different in terms of first world to third world difference. And so that hypocrisy of the reality versus the mythology is constantly fueling uprisings and movements that, slowly and slowly and slowly do make things better, but are also often exploited for political gain by some of the most egregious actors.
And so just a quick clarification. So there have been protests in Israel in solidarity with the anti-Black racism happening in the United States, where you have, Ethiopian Jews and other, Israelis, people of color, speaking out against some of the institutional racism they face, but still there is a bit of a self-censoring because you can't really connect it to the biggest taboo, which is Palestine, right?
I wouldn't say it's self-censoring. I would say that, just like in many places in the world, when you're fighting to go up one rung of the ladder, you're often not looking down. And I would say that when with the Mizrahi Sephardi kind of renaissance, now you have a whole cultural renaissance again of people who come from the Middle East and North Africa, kind of reasserting their cultural inheritance and their value and their languages in really kind of incredible ways. They're not looking at Ethiopian Jews, and the Ethiopian Jews are not looking at the reality of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, are looking obviously at the reality of Palestinians who are under occupation, but are physically and politically disconnected from them in a way that makes it very difficult to actually draw a lot of solidarity, just because the borders, the checkpoints, they're two completely different political systems, and over 70 years and 50 something years of the occupation, now also cultural differences, like there's now a growing difference between Palestinians who grew up in Jaffa or Haifa, or even in the Triangle in the north, versus Palestinians who grew up in Gaza or Ramallah or Bethlehem. Like those are now, because they've been segregated for so long, those are now culturally distinct communities who obviously struggle against the same thing, but experience completely different realities as well. So I would say it's not that there's self-censorship. I would say that when Black Americans are fighting for Black Lives Matter, they're not necessarily looking at homelessness, right? Like when we're looking at, they're not necessarily looking at the fact that the American empire has caused and aggravated racial tensions all over the world, right? Like the civil rights movement was really focused on the U.S. At the time when the U.S. was expanding its empire at an incredible rate, and creating civil rights issues all over the world. So there's always only so much you can focus on, especially if you're going to be strategic about what you're fighting for. But I think that the general, the sentiments are, once you realize that the differences between you are much smaller than the fact that you're fighting for the same things. You're fighting for equality and for a seat at the table, and for the dignity of having the same access as anybody else, no matter what color they're born. When you look at it in that generic term, there's a lot obviously of solidarity there, but the realities of settler-colonialism is that there's also so much segregation that even when people are fighting, radical movement for their rights, they often are not looking at who's below them on the rung, and I think Israel is no exception in that sense.
That's why we need to get rid of capitalism, but that's another story for another day. But exactly. And then one last question before I get to some of these bigger questions. Then is
you have bigger questions.
Oh yeah.
I feel like I've just talked for a half an hour.
But then just this one quick question before are there still big daily protests going on against Benjamin Netanyahu and his premiership, or is that still an ongoing process?
Yes, it is, and we're heading into elections now.
Oh, it's fallen
again.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much the achievement of the protesters, but the movement has been incredibly impressive. I mean, even during Corona, they've been protesting daily, weekly for months and months and months on end, demanding that the prime minister, resign. He's facing 4 different criminal trials. He's been in power for 11 years. It's time to go. So it's really an impressive movement, and the bottom line is, as of a few days ago, it's clear that we're heading into another election.
Unfortunately, there's no alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud because all of the, because there's not that much difference between all of the Israeli parties and how they would approach the economy. They all have a military-industrial complex. They're all very much wedded to the Israeli deep state, and of course, Palestine. I mean, are any of them really that serious about, making peace in Palestine and doing a democratic one-state solution? And I mean, the two-state solution, that's deader than dead, right?
Well, I mean, the two kind of serious alternatives to Netanyahu, which I'm not at all saying are better, even though Netanyahu is a horrible thing for Israel in Palestine, is Avigdor Lieberman, who has proven himself to be incredibly skillful at maneuvering the political map to stay afloat. However, Avigdor Lieberman is such an aggressive personality that he really only has a small kind of following that he maneuvers very powerfully. So he has inserted himself into being kind of the kingmaker position in a number of elections where, it was just too close to call, and it ended up depending on him to decide who's going to be the prime minister, which is an incredible amount of power for someone who wins 6, 7, 9 seats in an election. So I don't think he's a serious alternative, but I think that he's going to weasel his way into some kind of very high position. But the main opposition to Netanyahu right now is Neftali Bennett, who is a person who...
Neftali Bennett, but isn't he also like an ultra-Zionist?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's all about the scale you're looking at it, right? Like, if you look at the U.S. from the scale of a satellite, it doesn't really matter whether even you're looking at Canada or the U.S., like, it all looks the same. If you zoom in and you look at, red versus blue, then yeah, it looks like there's a difference. But if you're looking from the Middle East, I mean, as much as I vehemently detest Trump for the Middle East, he's significantly better than Hillary in terms of not starting new wars, in terms of taking out a lot of troops, in terms of withdrawing a lot of the American empire out of the Middle East, just out of his
also
sheer
not getting us to a nuclear holocaust with Russia, although his anti-China policy also is cause for concern.
Sure. Like, just, I don't know whether he's a bumbling idiot who's stumbling into less aggressive positions, or whether there's a strategy behind it, or whether the people behind him are moving the pieces. But clearly, the Trump presidency has led to significantly less Middle East conflict than a Hillary Clinton presidency would have done. So if you're looking from the outside, from that angle, you're like, yeah, it's better. But on the grand scheme of things, did that a Trump or a Biden presidency, is either one of them going to scale back American imperialism? I don't think so. Not in any kind of significant way. The world is not going to de-dollarize. The China and Russia are not going to succeed in terms of pushing the U.S. to third place. So, yeah, it depends on the scale. If you're an Israeli, there's a very big difference between a Netanyahu prime ministership and a Neftali Bennett prime ministership. If you're Palestinian, there's a huge difference. In fact, I would say that the annexation plan that Netanyahu rolled out, it's originally a Neftali Bennett roadmap. In fact, Neftali Bennett wrote his way into power the first time that he was elected on that roadmap, which is what he calls his one-state solution. So I think that there's a very big difference between the two of them, but it all depends on the scale that you're looking from.
Sorry about that. My internet got cut off for a moment. But yeah, you were pretty much saying that that's with Likud, if you compare them to Neftali Bennett's party or Avigdor Lieberman, they're actually way more to the right compared to Netanyahu, whereas blue and white and Labor are more middle of the ground. Okay, there still is going to be a pressure of Palestinians, but at least on paper, they want a two-state solution, right?
Well, I don't think that this spectrum of right and left really applies to Israeli politics. It doesn't work in the same way. If you want kind of like a foreigner's metaphor for what's going on, I would say blue and white are the status quo party. They want more or less the system to stay as it is, and for Israel to have a nicer image abroad. The Likud party is kind of an opportunist right party, which is, you can imagine them like the Republican Party before Trump. They say a lot of things, but then at the end of the day, they do whatever keeps them in power. Neftali Bennett, his strength is that he is not, like with Netanyahu, you never know where you stand, because Netanyahu is a brilliant like orator in terms of like he can verbally like
Sure.
shapeshift into whatever position will get him out of whatever. Like, and he has, you know, he has been building a narrative that the courts and the media are out to get him for 20 years. You know, since the 90s, he's been saying that, you know, I'm this like cowboy here at the top, and the media is out to get me, and the courts are prosecuting me for no good reason, and they want to prove that I'm corrupt. And that building that kind of narrative has really helped him now when finally the media is actually very critical of him, which is funny because one of the things he's being investigated or was investigated and is now in trial for is paying off one of the biggest news agencies to give him positive coverage. And Israeli media is incredibly centralized and corporate owned, obviously. So there's the corruption, it penetrates every level of it. So Netanyahu, if he's anything, he's a politician. Yeah, he comes from, you know, his dad, and he comes from a line of extreme revisionist Zionists who literally believe that Israel should be a Jewish only state. Sorry, I got a call, but I canceled it. Yeah, but like Netanyahu has formed alliances with people who, for example, his dad would vehemently disagree with, right? Like he has formed alliances with the ultra Orthodox. He has formed alliances with the Bennett party. He will form alliances with whoever gets him into power, and if he didn't get a lot of criticism for it, I'm sure he would even form alliances with the Palestinian parties. But Neftali Bennett is a much clearer case. Neftali Bennett made his money in the high tech. He is incredibly wealthy. He doesn't need this. He's doing it because he fully believes in it. And he is a settler through and through. He believes, you know, the roadmap that led to the annexation is his plan. It's his, what he used to call his one-state solution. And it basically pushes out Palestinians out of all the fertile land that you can get in the West Bank. He's very clear about the fact that he doesn't want to annex a lot of Palestinians into the Israeli populace, and so he comes up with ways to push the people into Palestinian urban centers as much as possible, and then close them in these Bantustan kind of like prisons, like the way Gaza's been an open air prison for 20 years. So he's very clear with what he wants. He's very open about it. He's not shapeshifting.
Actually that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is given that Israel wants to fully annex the West Bank. I mean, there's already been illegal settlements going on the West Bank for decades after decades, and and I mean the $1,000,000 question. I asked this to Eve Engler, Miko Peled, and Manar Adley. The times they were on 1+1, which is, are we seeing the ends of Palestine as we know it now? Unless of course Palestine solidarity movements across the globe, you know, protest and make it loud and clear that this is not acceptable.
So is that what you're asking me as well?
Yeah, like are we seeing the end of Palestine as we know it, with with the government wanting to fully annex the West Bank?
Yeah, I guess I would answer your question with two questions, which is, what do you mean by we, and what do you mean by Palestine? Because the Palestine that you know in the Solidarity West ended in 1948. Like the image that the left has in the West is in terms of the reality. So in my experience, having gone to on tour with my films in more than 20 countries, meeting intimately like solidarity leftists of all stripes in all these different places, it's very clear to me that there's a very big gap between the reality and the way that the leftist West understands it. And of course, in terms of not the left, I mean, if you're looking at the average person on the street, they just imagine some kind of desert landscape with like a bunch of religious fanatics fighting each other with sticks and stones. Like there's a huge gap between the reality and the fantasy. You know, the West Bank has become a place where people, obviously are occupied, but also live, right, and prosper and struggle against constant oppression from every angle, but have been in that position for more than 50 years. And so is Gaza. So there is a life that exists, against all odds, but it, has been around for so long, and Israel has been a country for so long. So the ethnic cleansing of Palestine has started, in the beginning of the 20th century, is still going on. Nothing in that regard has changed. The constant annexation of Palestinian fertile lands for the benefit of Israeli citizens, that's been going on for 100 years. The system of striated rights has been around since the beginning. Like, nothing has changed on the ground with this so-called annexation. The only thing that has changed is that it's now become official. So the two-state solution, whether or not you believe that either party with good faith, of what I've found as a journalist, I believe a lot of the Palestinian communities, especially the movements that led the first Intifada, approached the two-state solution and the peace process with a lot of hope and a lot of sincerity, regardless of where their leaders were in that regard. And I feel that a lot of the Israeli populace, especially the peace movements and the changes that were happening in the country, were approaching the peace process and the two-state solution with a lot of sincerity, but it's clear the Israeli leadership never was. And so what you have now is what was planned then. You have an apartheid system. Sorry, there's a cat here.
Yeah, no problem.
You have an apartheid system. You have people whose power is constantly eroded. 40% of Palestinian men under occupation have spent time in jail. So you have a constant destruction of any opportunity for Palestinians to recreate the peace movements of the first Intifada. Any political leader of any kind of talent is assassinated or immediately imprisoned or exiled. The way that and that is coupled with Israel investing significantly in Palestinian infrastructure and Palestinian basic needs, so that people get comfortable. And once people are a little bit comfortable, they're going to stop fighting, like you said, capitalism. So the Palestine as you know it, that never existed, but probably the Palestine that the West's left is imagining is a Palestine that was destroyed a long time ago. The Palestine that we live with today is a Palestine that is cut into pieces, that's living under apartheid, and that's not going to change under annexation. What I believe, and what a lot of, or a growing number of Israeli and Palestinian kind of like thinkers, journalists, analysts have been saying, is that this is potentially actually a good thing, because by annexing the rest of the West Bank and by basically dumping Gaza as an Egyptian problem, in exchange for the security collaboration that Israel and Egypt have been doing, the gas purchases and trade and all those things, the normalization with Egypt. If Egypt takes Gaza, and that's still a big if, and Israel just annexes the West Bank, then it is going to be forced to deal with what will then become an internal problem. The Palestinians who are under occupation, currently shoved into Bantustans in the West Bank, behind, all of these walls
and with that,
and parallel roads, and now they're basically going to be a part of this problem. In my opinion, the worst thing about the annexation is how little outrage it has sparked in terms of concrete outrage. So in previous times when Israel did unilateral things that were egregious and against all international standards and laws, there was a much bigger outrage, not just from activists, but in terms of economic withdrawals, companies would get disengaged from bids, working with Israeli projects. There would be diplomatic consequences, and we didn't see that with the so-called annexation plan. It just, there was a little bit of an outrage on the activist side. There was a few op-eds here and there, but everyone who is involved in the political landscape kind of shrugged, because of course Israel's been annexing the West Bank since it stepped foot in the West Bank. Like, that's not a surprise to anyone who's ever been there. This doesn't, besides like a muscle flex on behalf of Netanyahu at a very critical time for him in terms of his last re-election, it doesn't have much of a consequence. Or obviously it's going to have a consequence, but it didn't lead to a lot of outrage in terms of concrete punishment. So I think that was a very important bellwether for the Israeli Zionist leadership, whether it's Neftali Bennett or Netanyahu, is that now they know they can establish Trump Heights in the Golan Heights, which is technically occupied, right? They can announce an annexation plan. They can move embassies to East Jerusalem. They can do whatever they want. And the level of interest with a world on fire, where Israel and Palestine are now one of the quietest places in the Middle East. In a time when we are dealing with much bigger issues globally and also locally, wherever you look, they can get away with a lot more. And that is what's scary about the annexation, is that they could tomorrow announce that they are starting a slow deportation of all of the Palestinian citizens of the West Bank, and it's unclear whether the world is going to react. So those are the kinds of things that are really scary with the annexation. But in terms of the concrete change, in terms of the occupation, I don't see much change, and potentially even it forces a link between Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank, and it forces the question of apartheid and segregation into the Israeli public discourse, and might even force Israelis to tackle that.
One can only hope that it makes the path to a democratic one-state solution more likely, but I guess we'll have to, see. One question I wanted to ask you is, let me actually get to this big question in the event that we actually do run out of time, because you just mentioned about the character of the Israeli state, and you were talking earlier about settler colonialism and so forth, which is, you're working on a PhD at York University, and if I got this right, it's you're looking at what makes settler colonial societies adopt a collective blindness to those whom they oppress, and how that new media to oppress, like augmented reality, can be used to subvert this collective denial. I had a hard time reading my own handwriting right there.
Well, if it's not a mouthful, it's not a PhD question.
Exactly. Can you talk to us about that, because it's intricate, because it's very interesting, your thesis about settler colonialism adopting a collective blindness to those whom they oppress, and that collective denialism. And how do you compare that what Israel does to say Canada with its apartheid towards its First Nations people?
Yeah, I'm not looking comparatively. That would require a level of serious look that I'm just not engaged in. But certainly there's a lot of parallels between settler colonialism in Canada and settler colonialism in Israel, in terms of, I would say, the practices. So the Indian Act, which is the apartheid system that exists here in Canada, it's still called the Indian Act. People who are Indigenous are still forced to get something called their status. There's a parallel system of law that applies to Indigenous people in Canada versus non-Indigenous people. So there's definitely a lot of parallels in terms of, Palestinian, the split laws that exist for Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians non-citizens and Jewish citizens, or even Jewish people outside of Israel. Parallel systems of law in both places. In both places, the colonial project has evolved into a settler colonial project, and those are obviously parallel. But what I find most interesting is the settler colonial gaze, which is the way that the settler looks at, both physically and metaphorically, at the indigenous. And that's kind of what I work on in my PhDs. I'm developing a way of understanding and theorizing the colonial gaze as a system of false dichotomies that, on the one hand, for example, perceive the colonized as a primitive savage, or as a noble savage, or as a heathen, or as a child in need of parenting. Or even as a mythical, wise creature of the past, which is, a lot of mythology, a lot of the way that the settlers, at least here in Canada, understand the indigenous, if they even know anything about indigenous people. It's this very fantasy historic, avatar kind of idea. And these kind of dichotomies of setting up the native as opposed to the settler. The settler has history, the settler has written records, the settler has religion, the settler has a future. The indigenous is locked in a box of, either historic, non-attachment, right? Those dichotomies, they enable the colonial system, and they create a way of looking that connects the settler to the land in a different way that the indigenous are connected to the land. And that obviously manifests in a lot of visual systems, especially because I'm a filmmaker and I'm in the media studies department. It translates into a lot of visual language in terms of the panorama as a form of visual control over the landscape, the idea of the landscape as something that emerges in 19th century colonial literature and justifications. The pre-cinematic and early cinematic exotification of the colonized. There's a lot of things that go into building that understanding of me as a settler versus them. But when you progress through these dichotomies, which I would say the fact that they are dichotomies is in itself false, because it basically sets up a system of us and them. Once you follow that through to the settler colonial gaze, which is not just a system, while the colonial gaze is looking for ways to justify the domination of the colonized, the taking away from the colonized their labor, their resources. The settler colonial, which comes from people moving from one place to take over the land of other indigenous people, seeks to replace the native. And so what you really see in Israel is a denial of the history of the Palestinians, a denial of Palestinian attachment to the land, and not just in terms of an argument against, but an actual deletion. So, for example, if there's a plaque in a national park, it will only include ancient Hebrew history, skip over 2,000 years, and start again with Israel's creation. If there is a textbook, it will maybe include one Nakba, and then the rest would be about the Israeli version of 1948. In every way, whether it's in the news, whether it's in the public discourse, whether it's in the literature, the poetry.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
Did I lose you again?
Yeah. Geez, we're having so many problems today.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to finish that thought, the collective imaginary of who lives here, what they create, what's their value, and what do they own, right? It's a settler colonial imaginary. And the ultimate goal of both in Canada and Israel is to actually erase and become indigenized, to erase the native and for the settlers to become indigenous. So when Canadians proudly say, oh, my family's been here for 3 generations, it sounds ridiculous in the face of indigenous people who've been here, for 15,000 years. And for sure, that we found archaeologists have found all kinds of evidence of migrations here 12,000 years ago up to 15,000 years ago. So having 3 generations here is not that is ridiculous. In Israel, it's the same kind of thing where any Palestinian presence, whether it's remnants of a house that wasn't destroyed, whether it's Palestinian claims to their houses in terms of the right of return, has to be, incredibly skillfully ignored and basically made invisible, or aggressively denied, the way that the Israeli leadership is denying Palestinian right of return. Every time it comes up, it squashes it, immediately, so as to never even let it be a part of the negotiations. Or even more so, the Israeli settler colonial kind of collective imaginary replaces the Palestinian. And there's this incredible documentary that was shot about 20 years ago called 500 Dunam on the Moon. And the director of it, Rachel Leah Jones, interviews this family that lives in a Palestinian home in the north of Israel. And she kind of goes into their house and they proudly talk about, oh, you can really see this beautiful Arab architecture here. And they really don't see that they are living literally in the home of Palestinian indigenous people. They literally have weaved together their belonging to the local architecture, the local way of life, and you really see the erasure. And so what I'm looking at is when we look as settler colonists in Israel and also now I'm in Canada, when we look at the landscape, when we look at our place, when we look at our systems, what is it that we're not seeing? And that question came to me because of the first film I made. And all of the films I've made, that question keeps coming out. On the Side of the Road is named On the Side of the Road because it's trying to allude to the question of what is it on the side of the road all over Israel that we're not seeing, because almost all the Palestinian villages were demolished. But their ghosts, their remnants are everywhere. And you can't drive a single road in Israel without seeing something, some remnant, or there being some remnant of that destruction. And I think that for me, at least, because I grew up in Israel, I grew up in a settlement, I grew up inside of the deepest levels of that blindness and was completely unaware of the significance of the fact that I was a settler living in the West Bank, that I literally was a colonist on the front line of colonialism. I was completely oblivious to it. I didn't think about Palestinians outside of my sphere of consciousness, to the point where I realized physiologically I wasn't seeing them, I wasn't hearing them. And when I realized that shook me to the core, and that really crumbled the systems of blindness that were keeping the regime in place in my dedication to the regime. And so when I realized that, Zionism, this idea of supremacy, that we belong more, that more of a blank, right? And you can insert whatever indigenous community you want, because that kind of formula works in settler colonial states everywhere. Once you destroy the idea of supremacy, you really have to get to work. You really have to start working towards equality, or else you're part of the supremacy. And that supremacy is incredibly fragile. What keeps it up is, basically pillars made of glass. And but one of the things I'm looking at now, after trying journalism and trying documentary filmmaking, is new media, because new media is locative, so it's location based. So when you look at media like augmented reality, which is anything that interacts a virtual object.
Exactly. Because in your thesis, now I can read my own handwriting. It's how new media like augmented reality can be used to subvert this collective denial.
Yeah. So
continue.
Basically, it's an interaction of the virtual with the real. So like any Facebook filter that you have with bunny ears, it's augmented reality. I want to look at how you can use that to annotate and subvert the absence in the landscape, and to make it locative, to make it so that when you're on location, when you're walking through the national park, when you're going down the street in Tel Aviv, when you're driving through the north, those things that are invisible are rendered visible. And I want to see whether it has the same kind of impact that it, like, learning to see has had on me and thousands of other Israelis, and of course also Canadians here, who have kind of come to be aware and to literally to see their role in maintaining the settler colonial supremacy. Because for those of us who have had that kind of vision turn on, it's been a lifelong motivation. And I think that obviously the transformation of Israel-Palestine from a settler colonial reality into a democracy is not going to be led by an Israeli Jewish peace camp. But I don't think that it can happen without the support of the Israeli Jewish peace camp.
Yeah. And I think last two questions I wanted to ask, continuing on, last two questions I wanted to ask was, which is, how difficult is it for you as an Israeli to speak out? Because I, imagine, given, what happened with Norman Finkelstein, and given, some of the smear campaigns that have happened towards, Jewish North Americans, or any one of the, with Jewish North Americans and others, when they speak out against Israel, there's this, intense smear campaign. So so that being said, how difficult is it for you as an Israeli to speak out on Israel? And then, sort of the last question, which I can sort of tie into that, which is, I'm sure you were probably a witness to the intense smear campaign that Jeremy Corbyn and the People Power movements that were behind him were subjected to. There was this bogus anti-Semitism smear campaign, which sadly, led to his, defeat in the last general election. There were some problems in how Corbyn and his team responded, which I won't get into. But what the smear campaign against Corbyn proved to me, which is that even though there's this growing Palestine solidarity movement happening in the West and elsewhere, that smear campaign that that Israel and its supporters use, the anti-Semitism nonsense, still works. And that's even when most of the people who were subjected to those smear campaigns were, Jewish anti-Zionist voices. Which means that we also still have that issue of the progressive on everything except Palestine, socialist liberal on everything except Palestine, because so many of Jeremy Corbyn's own team said that, like, yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis, we're dealing with it.
And so what your question is?
So my question is, like, so my question is, like, are you still surprised, given the growing numbers of people who who are involved in Palestine solidarity movement, that the smear campaign still works? And because so many of those people that were part of that Corbyn project were Jewish people who were slandered as anti-Semites, that still means that the smear campaign works, and just like how difficult is it for somebody such as yourself or a Jewish person, speaking out against Israel?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things here. I think that the world is getting increasingly localized in its politics, and I think that it's becoming a lot harder for people to care about solidarity or what's going on somewhere else when they're dealing with so many local issues. That's certainly an issue here in Canada, where I don't know about Britain, but here in Canada, there is a prevailing sense that Israel is the aggressor. All the in the Jewish community show that people understand that Israel is the aggressor, but in terms of taking action, there's very little, certainly very little with chops. And I think that's probably also true in Europe to some extent, but that's not on my radar. I would say that the smear campaign works, but the smear campaign has lost a lot of its efficacy. When in 2005, when the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement first started, all you needed to do is to say that some politician supports it and that person's career would be over. And today they fought very, very, very hard, and until the last minute, it could have gone either way, because more and more and more and more people are starting to realize that anti-Semitism is, when it's lobbied as a way to silence people critical in Palestine, is not actual anti-Semitism. At the same time, there is a growing, alarming increase in anti-Semitism that the left is struggling to deal with. And just as in the West, it's really difficult to understand how to be in solidarity with Palestinians, for example, without inevitably being an anti-Semite. There's a very big issue on the left, especially the pro-Palestinian left, in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism and standing in solidarity with Jewish people when they experience anti-Semitism. I run, one of my jobs here in Canada is I run a Jewish school. It's a secular school. It's a Sunday secular school, and it's a social justice-based school. And I'm the education director of it. And it's an incredible place. It's the only secular school in the city. And we intertwine social justice into the way that we teach Jewishness. This rich 4,000-year history. And we make sure the kids understand the context of their Jewishness as part of a global civilization. And my organization, which the school is just a part of, was attacked a number of times by anti-Semitic slogans and by posters. And on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, which is the night when, in the 30s, Nazis went around and broke so many Jewish businesses' windows that there was glass all over the streets, and it's called Kristall Night. On that anniversary, we had a book release of one of the community members who released a book about Canada's complicity in the Holocaust. That night, we got posted and attacked by neo-Nazis. And by and large, the left has been silent on that. And it's heartbreaking because bigotry and racism towards Jewish people is part of the same continuum of bigotry and racism towards any community. But because when people assert themselves as pro-Palestinian, as have we, our organization has been on the front line of Jewish solidarity with Palestine in Canada for decades. They feel that solidarity with Jewish people, or even the worst case scenario when Jewish people get attacked, is somehow complex. And so I think that just like in any political community, asking ourselves hard questions, asking them to the end, working our way through what that means is an exercise that we all have to be doing. But until we do that, I think the smear campaigns are going to have power. Here in Canada, the government, both provincially and federally, is trying to pass the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a big part of what they used against Corbyn, and it has been used to silence academics all over, and thinkers and scholars and activists all over the world. And if it passes, it basically says that criticizing Israel's nature as an apartheid state is a form of anti-Semitism, which, if you think about it, it's not. If it passes, it will be another layer of silencing. But what I am seeing, that even though Israel has skillfully succeeded in getting a number of governments to implement official kind of censorship on Israel-Palestine, the population has become jaded and completely and becoming increasingly immune to these kinds of censorships. And by and large, Israel's aggressions against the Palestinians have been so violent, so extreme, so asymmetrical that anyone who's paying attention can see what's going on. So no, I don't think the smear campaign by and large is succeeding if you look at a 20-year trajectory. As a Jewish person, obviously I face criticism and ostracization, but at the same time, I am part of a growing and wonderful community of Jewish people who are critical of settler colonial white supremacy. And I find that the way that we express our Jewishness in that regard is the work of Tikkun Olam, and it's the work of my Jewish identity. So I think that more than ever, there is now a home for my kind of Jewish and a growing attachment to my roots as a Jewish person who, obviously is attached to Israel, also lives in the diaspora half my life, or a certain amount of my life. And so I think things are getting better in terms of the smearing campaigns.
Oh, wow, that's the first optimistic that's the first optimistic response I ever got because when I saw the Jeremy Corbyn project be completely eviscerated, for me it was like, all right, there's just like no hope for
Well, they could have done better, to be honest. They could have dealt with it in a much more adult way. They could have, there's so much that could have been done there. I don't think that it's just a one-sided thing that they were smeared and then they crumbled. But again, it's not really on my radar. And I also think, like, on the left, for some reason, we have a hard time admitting our wins, and we have a hard time celebrating anything that's positive.
True.
And the only way that we can talk about politics is through humanitarian crisis, and everything is terrible and it's only getting worse. And I just think that that's not a good way to motivate. And it's also not necessarily true. I don't want to fight against. I want to fight for. And I think that's what's motivated me in everything that I do in terms of media and also in terms of activism. And in terms of, like, if you're going to be a journalist, you need to know history. And if you know history, you know that objectively speaking, there's a number of things that are better. There's a lot of things that are worse, but also it's part of a, growing meta cycles. So you gotta keep your ear to the ground and gotta keep a smile on your face somehow.
Well, yeah, and I mean, well, I won't get too much into the whole Corbyn thing because I have covered it, but I do think that just politics 101, when you are being smeared, just call BS to the smear campaign, and they could have done a much better job defending those Jewish voices like Jackie Walker and countless others who were Jewish people speaking out against Israel. And I think we're doing a very good job at giving legitimate criticisms towards Israel and trying to, and all that jazz. But yeah, once you give legitimacy to a smear campaign, it's very hard to then kind of take back that, oh no, but it's unfortunately unfortunately it ended the way it did. Hopefully others learn from that. But it is interesting what you were just mentioning, that the anti-Semitism attacks, the actual anti-Semitic attacks that were happening at your school. That's very sobering. If many did not come out and and denounce that. And I think you talked about this last time, how unfortunately the worst thing about when people talk about Israel Palestine is they keep talking about it as if it's some kind of a football game where my side is always right, your side is always wrong, and all of that. And when you have
that's right.
Yeah, and that's
even when Pittsburgh happened, right? Even when the attacks in Germany happened on the synagogue, Pittsburgh happened on Shabbat, the holiest day of the week for Jews, and 11 people were murdered. And it took a long time for people on the left to stand in solidarity with Jewish people. And even when you had that conversation, there was always a but, right? And one of the main reasons that person attacked that particular synagogue is because that synagogue was involved in supporting a migrant caravan of migrants from Central America to the U.S., right? They were doing social justice work. I'm not saying that they're amazing on Palestine, but if we judge people based on black and white categories, then we're going to have to be very clear on a number of other things that we support that may be things that we don't necessarily believe in, right? Not like there isn't the Palestinians, right? There's secular Palestinians, there's religious, there's Christian and Muslim, there's the political elite, there's the farmers, there's the fantasies that we have when we think of politics as a black and white game. They perpetuate the problem. And when we start to look at Israel and Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians, as complex societies, right? And our solidarity with them, as ourselves inserting ourselves into the lives of millions of people, then I think that we gain a lot more responsibility for the work that we do, right? It's very easy to say, oh, I stand against apartheid, I'm pro-Palestinian. But when you actually look at what that means, you are inserting yourself from your comfortable position in the West into the lives of billions of people. And you're saying that by articulating your opinion, you're basically advising people on what they should do an ocean away. And I think that that is something we should do very carefully. I think that if we're going to do that effectively, what we need to be doing is looking at how our governments are sponsoring, unjust regimes, and we also need to do that and constantly look back at where we stand and constantly analyze, because the reality changes all the time, and we can't use the markers of 150 years ago in order to look at what is going on with capitalism today. We can't look at just what happened in 1948 to understand what's going on with Palestine today. Like, we need to constantly keep thinking, keep questioning, and look at the fact that, yes, also anti-Semitism is on the rise. And it is something that Jewish people have been talking about, and have largely been ignored ever since the new generation has brushed off anti-Semitism into something that happened in the past. So I think that when we stand against racism, when we stand against bigotry, obviously, the 95% of the Jewish community in North America is Ashkenazi, or let's say percent. So it's a largely white community, but there's also a very big community of Jews of color here. And also, the fact that someone is white does not necessitate that they are part of the white hegemony. And so, when Jewish people, for example, get attacked in the Orthodox communities, one of the questions I often get is, well, why don't they just stop wearing those weird clothes and just blend in, and then they won't be attacked? And I think that that is an incredibly anti-Semitic position, because it's basically saying that in order for you to exist inside of my society, you have to abandon who you are and what your ancestors have taught in order to mimic the way that you could possibly be like me. But even if, as a secular Jew who doesn't dress in an Orthodox way, I'm not a part of the hegemonic white community by and large in an absolute sense. Sure, I benefit from its privileges, but I'm also part of something completely different, and have the historic and ancestral sacrifices to show for that. And I think that those are important things to understand, that when you're criticizing the Jewish community from the outside for not taking the Palestinian, the pro-Palestine, or the critical position that you think that they should take, if you're not a part of that community, you're still operating inside of a power dynamic that potentially can be anti-Semitic, and we've seen a number of people be anti-Semitic, including Eve Engler, and I think that we need to be much more tough-skinned about it. I think we need to be much more gentle about it as well. I think we need to have much clearer conversations about where we stand, and we have to think deeper about what do these grand principles on the left that we believe in, what do they mean in a day-to-day, what do they mean in different contexts, and not necessarily approach the events as they unfold with a pre-made mold based on a number of theories or books or analyses from previous events, because history rhymes, but it's not repeating itself identically. And I think that keeping ourselves on our toes is a big part of not stumbling into really terrible positions.
Interesting. I'll I guess I myself certainly have to also, keep that in mind, because that was quite shocking to, to hear that, here's an anti-Semitic attack that happens on this school in Canada, and it's not getting the wide condemnation. Although I think, in defense of of my friend Eve Engler, I'm sure he would deny that he would say that he has said anything anti-Semitic. Although I know that on his website he has clarified some of his position, his responses to criticisms that people have made of his, be it some of his anti.
Eve Engler's a classic example of someone who wrote that if Jewish people want to stop getting attacked anti-Semitically, they should stop living in Jewish communities and dressing like Jews and blend in. Right? That's the idea behind for which he was criticized, and he could have handled it a lot better than he did. And also, the critics could have handled it a lot better than he did, right? Like when a person makes a bigoted assumption and they slip into, racist ideas, that's not necessarily mean that they need to be canceled and they need to be shamed and they need to be publicly dragged through the coals. It means that that person needs to go through a lot of self-education, that you need to pay special attention to how the left deals with anti-Semitism. And we don't need to form camps of I'm pro-Eve or I'm anti-Eve. We need to reach out and we need to have like basically conversations, right? Like I have no doubt that Eve's intention comes from a good place. But he made a mistake. I've made mistakes in the past, and I would have benefited a lot more if the people that I hurt, obviously it's not the job of the injured to educate the injurer, but I think that if I was educated at that time from a place of compassion rather than scolded from a place of chastising, I think I would have learned a lot more. But I'm not a big fan of cancel culture in general. So I really think that we are all works in progress and we need to be a lot gentler with each other. But yeah, when someone does something and says something that is fucked up, we need to call them out on it. And we don't need to shame them for it. We need to understand that, intentions are a big part of the question. Context is a big part of the question. And I don't think on the left that we should be so afraid of also including anti-Semitism into the way that we understand the evolution and growth of racism and bigotry around the world.
Yeah, and I know on Eve's website, I think like I said, I think he responded to some of the criticisms he made and did say that he was definitely growing and making sure that that some of his criticisms that he better educates himself and all and all of that jazz. And interesting. Alrighty. Until then, I think we sort of covered everything. Unless anything else you would like to add in terms of people who may be feeling hopeless about finding a just solution to Israel and Palestine, and to those in Britain who are at the moment disheartened because the censorship around even discussing Israel and Palestine is getting more and more intense, and of course every country trying to adopt the IHRA definition. But you even said earlier that that we shouldn't despair. Things are getting better, but we just have to keep at it. So, any last comments you'd like to make to those?
The only thing I would say is stop focusing so much on solutions. Like it's really not up to you. It's really up to us and the Palestinians about what solution, quote unquote, we're going to end up with. What you could do abroad is to focus on what your government is doing. The Canadian government, for example, is deeply involved in an arms trade to the tune of billions of dollars with Israel. There's a whole plethora of free trade agreements and exceptions that Israel falls under with Canada that we can focus on. Canadian companies are, Canada's foreign policy is often in contradiction with Canada's actions on Israel. So there's a number of things that as Canadians we could be doing to alter Canada's involvement in Israel and Palestine. And the same thing, for you're in Belgium, same thing with Belgium or anywhere else that you are, you can't really impact whether it's going to be a one or a two-state solution. Stop wasting your mental energy on debating that. What you can impact is what your local government is doing, what your federal government is doing to support Israel and Palestine. And those are the things that if you successfully impact are going to have a much bigger impact on Israel-Palestine than whether or not you think that you should stand for a one or two-state solution. Like your position is much less important than your actions. And in terms of effective actions, you can impact your government. You can't really impact Israel's government. That's what I believe.
Alrighty, and I think as my good friend Dimitri Lascaris, 3 times who was on the show, once said to me in this issue about hope versus pessimism. He said that in the climate crisis we can't afford to be pessimistic. So we just have to sort of kind of keep calm and carry on. There are going to be definitely terrible defeats, but with people power in the fight against climate change, we just have to sort of keep at it, and yeah. All right. Until then,
Thanks,
we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Leah Tarachonsky. Ms. Tarachonsky, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to have you back in the future. And once your thesis is done, send it to me by email, because I would be very curious to read it. So.
Well, lucky for me, I'm doing a research creation PhD, so it's going to be I'm going to create an AR that you can actually go to Israel and experience on your phone, which I think is a much friendlier way to convey research than a dissertation. And I'm very lucky that that's an option for academics these days.
All righty. Well, we are joined on 1+1 with Leah Tarachonsky. Thank you so much for joining us. And and one last thing. Happy Hanukkah. Isn't it Hanukkah week this week?
It is on Thursday. Thank you very much. You say Hanukkah Sameach or Chag Sameach.
All right. Well,
and Merry Christmas to you, huh?
Well, I hope you have I hope you have a great Hanukkah, and
thank you.
And the people united will never be defeated. So power to the people in that thing, and I hope I hope you enjoy a really great one, and all peace, loving people around the of the Jewish community as well.
Yeah, Bezrat Hashem, or Inshallah.
Ciao, ciao.